This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod.
Art of Darkness. I am Brad Kelly. First things first, you are not going to hear Kevin's voice on this episode, and that's because Kevin is not here. And that's because the Kautzman family has welcomed a new addition. So if you follow Kevin on any social media, go, send him some heart emojis, send him find his baby gift registry and send him something. He'll be back with us. It's just kind of it happened, I think, in the last 24 hours. So can't expect him to be here in the seat. So he will be back the next time we talk. And Kevin, if you're listening to this, congratulations, man. I know I said it I said it in the DMs, but congratulations. That's awesome. Super excited. Can't wait to meet that little fella. So today, for people who haven't listened before, this is a dark room episode, and what we do is we've done an in-depth sort of biographical profile touching on the work of a subject, in this case, Denis Johnson, and then we find somebody who knows our subject a little better, a little differently, sometimes both. We bring them in, and we use this space to kind of further develop our understanding of this figure. The Denis Johnson episode remains behind the paywall. So people who want to get on, if you want to check that out, patreon.com/artofdarkpod, substack.com/@artofdarkpod, to check that out. But I don't think that's going to stop us from talking to great Aaron Burch today. Aaron is the author of the novel Year of the Buffalo, as well as How to Write a Novel, which is a collection of craft essays. I love this. I don't know if it's subtitle, but the description, quote, none of which ever mention writing, which it's just great. You sold me on that. Also wrote fairly recently, it came out at the same time as How to Write a Novel, A Kind of In Between, which is a book of essays. He is the editor of Short Story Long, which you can find on Substack, and the editor/co-editor of Had. So Aaron, thank you so much. Welcome to the show. How you doing?
Thanks so much for having me. I am doing great. My semester is winding down, and so I'm feeling both free and also I feel like probably some of what we chat about is going to be filtered through both teaching in general and the sort of like the excitement of a semester ending. Feels like
sure. There's
the lens.
There's something to that too, a little bit of senioritis, right? It's like some of those last little things can be hard to get that little bit of motivation that you'd normally have. I recall those days.
They can for sure. It's like,
yeah.
But excited to be wrapping up.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. So, I had been following you on Twitter for a while, and I saw that you tweeted out some high praise of Denis Johnson's story, The Largesse of the Sea Maiden. And that's kind of where we're going to focus our conversation today. We'll wander wherever we end up going, but we're going to start there at least. Let me just set up kind of background for Largesse of the Sea Maiden, and then we'll talk about the story more specifically. So the short story Largesse of the Sea Maiden was originally published in the New Yorker in 2014. People may know Denis Johnson passed away in 2017. It's the title. It shares the title with his final short story collection, which came out in 2018. And Denis Johnson had just put the finishing touches on it weeks before he passed. That collection won was a finalist for the 2018 National Book Critics Circle Award, and is great. The whole thing is incredibly good. as one might expect. Um, but I guess, I mean, it's kind of the first question. We just described what Largesse of the Sea Maiden is, and as a sort of a library slot. But Aaron, what is it in general? Why do you love it so much? What's so good about it?
Yeah, so I think the slightly bigger picture is sort of like a lot of writers, and certainly a lot of writers my age. I came to really love Jesus's Son when I kind of first started reading more and writing more. I kind of discovered it in the early 2000s, and pretty quickly it became um, this kind of like talismanic book, or this totem, right? Um, and so by the time that Largesse came out, the story itself in the New Yorker in 2014, I guess in 2014, by then I was like, I had gone back to grad school. I was a New Yorker subscriber. And so like I got the print issue in the mail in whatever that week of in February of 2014.
Mhm.
And was probably just excited for a new Dennis Johnson story, right?
Sure,
I
that's
think
that's cool. You get the New Yorker, and it shows up, and sometimes you flip, and you're like, I don't know who this is or what this is about. I might not even have time for this. And then, there's a new Dennis Johnson piece. I'm gonna have to, hold
yeah.
my calls.
Exactly. So sometimes it's like, oh, here's an author I love. I'm excited. And
Mm,
and so pretty immediately dug in, and it just felt, and I only have really maybe a handful of stories like this where it felt immediately upon first read just like a classic story. And and it kind of gave me that like, cool guy feeling to be reading it at the time and be like, oh, I immediately know that this is going to stick with me and be anthologized and be important. It feels like most of those stories, like Jesus' Son itself, and a lot of the sort of classic um whatever canon had been kind of before I became a writer. So by 2014, by then I've been at that point, I've been working on Hobart, this journal I started for, over 10 years. I was writing and I was like, oh, this is coming out into my very contemporary life. And it feels so that was kind of my initial response, was just immediately falling in love with it as a story. And then now being one that I return to often.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's in the, I don't even want to quite say unusual. I mean, it's a little longer than, I think, when you say short story, people are thinking, 8, 10, 12, 15, maybe 20 pages. I think in my collection, the collection I have on paper here, I think it's about 40 pages or close to that. Um, it's also, um, and correct me if, this feels like I'm overstating it. It doesn't really have a plot.
No, that's
Is
right.
that fair? Okay.
Yeah. And I,
And
I
this isn't a criticism, it's just a kind of describing what the story is. Yeah.
No, and I think that sort of is true in a couple of ways. One is that I think more Dennis Johnson stories than not kind of don't have a plot,
Mm.
or insofar as you describe their quote unquote plot, you're really just like describing the two or three kind of short story set pieces that
Right,
happen, and
right.
you're kind of like, that's the arc of the story.
Yeah, the character
Um,
and maybe where it takes place and like one thing that happens in it. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really all kind of like voice and character and point of view, and it feels kind of like a hangout story,
Mhm.
right? I don't know if we often kind of talk about writing like that, but I know kind of I love a hangout movie, right? Like a Dazed and Confused, or like something that you just kind of like put on and you're like, I don't know, there's not much plot, but I'm just kind of hanging out with these characters and I love getting to hang out with them. And I love the kind of like vibes that being in that world feels like.
Yeah, I love those movies too. You know, Big Lebowski comes to mind, right? It's the plot is kind of there, but it's mostly to get you from one scene where the characters are spending time with each other to another scene where they're spending time with each other, right? It's sort of,
Yeah,
yeah,
totally.
yeah. But in this case, it's more like the main character, Wit, is hanging out with himself, I guess.
That's right. And so then on top of too, on top of kind of the general, there not being that much arc or plot, is
Mm,
it's broken down into these subheadings, right? So the story is compiled. I think it's like a dozen. It might be
That's about
11 or
right. Yeah.
13 kind of short pieces, all of which I think are kind of in the 4-page range, give or take. Um, and so one of the cool things about the New Yorkers, when they publish short fiction, they pair it with a an interview with the author.
Mhm.
And so at the time, I remember reading that interview and having gone back to it a handful of times over the years. And Johnson says that he wrote these when he was teaching, and he would assign his students to write, in essence, a flash fiction, like a story of a
Mm.
1,000 words or less. So then he was kind of writing them along with him. And so he was kind of writing these initially as separate flash fictions across years. And then at
Ah.
some point, I think he was like, oh, these are all the same character. These are all the same voice. What happens when I put them together? Um, but I feel like finding that out kind of, I don't know, sometimes a peek behind the curtain like that can turn me off, can be like, oh, I didn't want
Yeah.
to know that. I just want the
I just love
magic,
the
right?
piece. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't want to see the wizard behind the curtain.
Mhm.
But I think knowing that kind of unlocked something for me too, and was sort of like, oh, that is kind of how they work. But there is something about that, like the whole for me does feel greater than the sum of its parts, right? There's something
Yeah.
about that wholeness of wit and his point of view that's really satisfying.
Yeah, I completely co-sign that. I mean, eh, there's always an effect, I've I've heard people say before, and this isn't necessarily me advocating for this position, but that like the fundamental sort of subunit of art is just two things next to each other. And all of the creativity comes with what do you put what next to what, right?
Right.
And the story is an exercise in like what happens when you put these things that are fairly disparate, not really connected except sort of emotionally and maybe aesthetically at times, and what happens, and it ends up feeling incredibly lived in. Like
Yes.
it feels like, yeah, this is sort of what life is like. It's kind of just it's sort of scrambled a little bit, and one thing kind of blurs into the next. And yeah, maybe we can talk about, I don't like to necessarily play favorites, but are there any of these 11, 12, 13 sub stories, scenes that really, strike you perhaps a little more than the others?
Um, so I mean the first one for a multitude of reasons. One is just because it's first, right?
Mhm.
And so when I teach, I talk a lot about beginnings. One, because I think they're so important. Two, it's just as a teacher, they're easier to talk about than endings because
Yeah.
you can give them context, right?
Right,
Like,
right, right.
or you can
And
give them
and
context lists,
no, barely anybody knows how to write endings, right? It's
right?
like
But then
it's
also
different
like
every
in
time.
in
Yeah.
order to understand an ending, you have to read the whole thing.
Mhm.
Whereas I can go into class and look at 10 different openings and be like, oh, how do they work as an
Right,
opening?
right.
What is it set up? Um, so I love that about it. I love that essentially what happens in this opening called Silence is it's a few couples kind of drinking at a dinner party. So at the
Mhm.
core of the story, I mean, it's kind of what we talk about when we talk about love, right? It's like
Mhm.
Dennis Johnson's Carver story.
Oh, it felt very much like a
Um,
Carver story, and not to denigrate at all. It's just like, oh,
no,
we're in that territory. That's cool.
and I
Yeah.
I think I love that as both a reader and a writer. Like I loved kind of recognizing that, but then also the pleasure of seeing how Dennis Johnson did something different with it. But
Mhm.
then as a writer, and also I guess as a teacher, I love acknowledging that you can borrow and play with other people's stuff that I think especially beginning writers can often feel like, oh, if they did that, I can't touch on that because that's off limits, or I would plagiarize, or
Right.
that, or whatever. It's like, well, how do you maybe take that premise and turn it into your own and twist it? And so I love kind of seeing how it does feel at its core so Carver, but it also feels so Dennis Johnson-y, right? And
Yeah,
so
once the details come in, it's like, oh, this
yeah,
isn't actually a Carver story. It's just
yeah,
sort of it's on the Raymond Carver channel, but it's it's late night or something. It's a
right.
different yeah. Yeah. And just for people to kind of get a sense, I mean that and that one well, I don't know if you wanted to. I asked if you wanted to read something. I don't know if you want to read something from that one or not, or I can
Yeah, I
give
could
it.
read either that one or I love Farewell also. I thought Farewell
Farewell
might be
was
a
the
fun one
one.
to read,
Is that the
which is where
one
he
with?
gets the call from his
I
ex.
love that. I love that one. That's my favorite one.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's where I was gonna head next
Okay, cool.
was
Yeah.
um
Let's,
uh Ad Man. The very first sentence in Ad Man is one of my favorite sentences of all
oh,
time.
let me see. I don't
Um
know if I
So
caught
it's kind of a
this.
long, I'm a sucker for a long sentence and I'm a sucker for something with an M dash. So
Yes.
Adman starts, this morning I was assailed by such sadness at the velocity of life, the distance I've traveled from my own youth, the persistence of the old regrets, the new regrets, the ability of failure to freshen itself in novel forms that I almost crashed the car.
Yeah.
So I just think about that sentence all the time and how much it does, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
kind of like the vibes of it and the writerly moves and
Mhm.
the but uh but yeah, and then I love Farewell. Was that
Yeah, I'm not sure. They
that's the
feel
one that
like
you said is your favorite is
that is probably
Farewell,
that
yeah.
one and the one about the painting, which is
Oh yeah.
okay, accomplices, I think. Yeah. Yeah. But so yeah, so farewell is he gets a he gets a call from his ex-wife, and
Yeah.
it's incredibly poignant.
It is. Yeah. Did you want me to read that one?
Sure, yeah, if you
I
don't
don't
mind. I
know.
mean, I can also do it, but we love to read stuff on here.
I
It's
can read it. I think it's relatively short. I
yeah,
don't
let's do it.
and uh so I think it's the fourth section. So it's called Farewell. Elaine got a wall phone for the kitchen, a sleek blue one that wears its receiver like a hat, with a caller ID readout on its face just below the keypad. While I eyeballed this instrument, having just come in from my visit with the chiropractor, a brisk, modest tone began, and the tiny screen showed 10 digits I didn't recognize. My inclination was to scorn it like any other unknown. But this was the first call, the inaugural message. As soon as I touched the receiver, I wondered if I'd regret this, if I was holding a mistake in my hand, if I was pulling this mistake to my head and saying hello to it. The caller was my first wife, Virginia, or Ginny, as I'd always called her. We'd been married long ago in our early 20s and put a stop to it after 3 crazy years. Since then, we hadn't spoken. We had no reason to, but now we had one. Ginny was dying. Her face came faintly. She told me the doctors had closed the book on her. She'd ordered her affairs. The good people from hospice were in attendance. Before she ended this earthly transit, as she called it, Ginny wanted to shed any kind of bitterness against certain people, certain men, especially me. She said how much she'd been hurt and how badly she wanted to forgive me, but she didn't know whether she could or not. She hoped she could, and I assured her from the abyss of a broken heart that I hoped so too, that I hated my infidelities and my lies about the money and the way I'd kept my boredom secret and my secrets in general. And Ginny and I talked after 40 years of silence about the many other ways I'd stolen her right to the truth. In the middle of this, I began wondering, most uncomfortably, in fact, with a dizzy, sweating anxiety, if I'd made a mistake. If this wasn't my first wife, Jenny, no, but rather my second wife, Jennifer, often called Jenny. Because of the weakness of her voice and my own humming shock at the news, Also, the situation around her as she tried to speak to me on this very important occasion. Folks coming and going, and the sound of a respirator, I supposed. Now, 15 minutes into this call, I couldn't remember if she'd actually said her name when I picked up the phone, and I suddenly didn't know which set of crimes I was regretting. Wasn't sure if this dying farewell, clobbering me to my knees in true repentance beside the kitchen table, was Virginia's or Jennifer's. This is hard, I said. Can I put the phone down a minute? I heard her say okay. The house felt empty. Elaine, I called. Nothing. Wiped my face with a dish rag and took off my blazer and hung it on a chair and called out Elaine's name one more time and then picked up the receiver again. There was nobody there. Somewhere inside it, the phone had preserved the caller's number, of course, Jenny's number or Jenny's, but I didn't look for it. We'd had our talk, and Jenny or Jenny, whichever, had recognized herself in my frank apologies, and she'd been satisfied, because, after all, both sets of crimes had been the same. I was tired. What a day. I called Elaine on her cell phone. We agreed she might as well stay at the Budget Inn on the east side. She volunteered out there teaching adults to read, and once in a while she got caught late and stayed over. Good. I could lock all three locks on the door and call it a day. I didn't mention the previous call. I turned in early. I dreamed of a wild landscape, elephants, dinosaurs, bat caves, strange natives, and so on. I woke, couldn't go back to sleep, put on a long terry cloth robe over my PJs, and slipped into my loafers and went walking. People in bathrobes stroll around here at all hours, but not often, I think, without a pet on a leash. Ours is a good neighborhood, a Catholic church and a Mormon one, and a posh townhouse development with much open green space, and on our side of the street, some pretty nice smaller homes. I wonder if you're like me, if you collect and squirrel away in your soul certain odd moments when the mystery winks at you. When you walk in your bathrobe and tasseled loafers, for instance, well out of your neighborhood and among a lot of closed shops, and you approach your very faint reflection in a window with words above it. The sign said sky and celery. Closer, it read ski and cyclery. I headed home.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a story. Just the mistaken identity has this it's sort of like a joke in a way, right? Like
Yeah.
it's funny. Just that confusion, just that like, oh wait, who am I talking to? But that's what Denis Johnson seems to me to be so good at is taking those sort of moments of irony and making them like these universalized, heart-rending human experiences. Yeah, I love that so much. And with the one line, sorry, I'm kind of flipping around here. The one line, uh, I suddenly didn't know which set of crimes I was regretting. And then
Yeah.
kind of later comes to terms with the fact that they're both the same anyway.
Both sets of crimes had been the same.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I
So
love it
cool.
too. And exactly what you're saying. And I think that's one of the things that Dennis Johnson often does so well is this kind of simultaneously kind of two different modes. And sometimes it's like the thing that I think about most often is just like how writerly perfect the sentences are. But then also it just feels like somebody telling you a story. And
Yes.
those things, like I think in any other writer would maybe seem at odds with one another, but he seems to perfectly marry them.
Mhm.
And and what you mentioned too, like at the heart of this short is just kind of this joke, is kind of like mistaken name.
Mhm.
But but he's pairing that mistaken name with this like pretty deep soul searching
Mhm.
and pretty kind of like aching thoughts about aging.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and the aging thing too is fairly subtle because he's by the end of that bit, by the end of this farewell section of the story, he's doing things that we sometimes associate with like older people becoming senile, right? It's kind of out walking in the neighborhood in his bathrobe. Um, and then that moment, which is a repeat at a much smaller scale of the same joke of mistaking sky and celery for ski and cyclery, but there is this like resignation to it. Like, I guess this is how it is now. I guess I don't always know what I'm looking at or what I'm hearing, and I've
Yeah,
gotten
like
wires crossed.
things are meaningful, but also I might be deriving meaning from the mistaken
R-
misunderstanding,
Right,
right?
right. Exactly. Which is then it's like, is that yeah, if you have a meaningful experience and you realize that, oh, you had all the facts wrong, does that take away the meaning? I mean, you still had it, right?
Right.
And that's kind of part of the, I guess, he references the mystery winking at you. I think that's kind of part
Yeah,
of that.
I wanted to come back to that line, like that the final long paragraph before the
Mhm.
kind of ski and cyclery. It's like, I wonder if you're like me, if you collect and squirrel away in your soul certain odd moments when the mystery winks at you. It feels like such a perfect, beautiful moment for this character who's sort of at odds with what's happening in his life. But also, I feel like there's a summation there of that's how I think of Dennis Johnson, the human, as moving through the world,
Mhm.
as like especially adept at paying attention to these small moments that he's collecting. And I feel like coming back to this story, not really feeling like it has a plot, but it's a collection of so many great and wonderful moments. And I don't totally know how he wrote, but I feel like I picture him as just like constantly just paying attention to the world and being like, oh, there's a story there or there's a moment,
Right.
right? And maybe just a little bit more observant or aware of some of the mysteries of life than most of us might just take a moment for granted.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. He's certainly this incredible observer. I think I wonder too, I mean, not that this is in the territory of just straight up auto fiction, just changing the names, but I do think I had done some biographical, I did a fair amount of biographical research on Dennis Johnson in preparation for our core episode that we did. We tell the whole life story of him, and as much as we can. I mean, he's a semi-reclusive figure, and the big, if it's ever coming, the big biography, the doorstopper biography has not come out. So it's kind of scattered in terms of tracing his life, but he was married young, and that marriage ended in divorce. So you could imagine that something like this happened, or he sort of it's a him thinking through if it did happen. Um, but it also makes me think of it. It sort of makes me think that this story is I don't want to use the word, but there's really no other way. I think it's sort of a you could imagine that Wit is fuckhead grown up
Totally.
from Jesus' son. To me,
Sure.
40 years have gone by. He got out of the drug stuff. He kind of sorted himself out a little bit. He got into a career, and now we're 63 years old. And this is what it's like to be fuckhead at 63, right?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely this story and kind of this whole collection, I feel like feels, I mean, it's kind of crazy that these are his only two collections, Jesus'
Hmm.
Son and this, and
Right.
they both feel like in conversation with each other while also so different,
Hmm.
right? But it's like all of the things that made Jesus' Son this kind of like manic energy of a fuck up in their 20s
Hmm.
feels like it's being reconciled now as like all of these stories are kind of longer, they're
Hmm.
slowed down, they feel more meditative, and they feel like this kind of mirror image or the other side of the coin of that frenetic drug energy that's
Hmm.
now like wrestling with life as you get older.
Yeah, and it certainly doesn't sort of fall into a trap of like, now we're older and we're wiser. Here's all the things we learned about the mistakes we made and how we wouldn't make them again. It's much more richly textured than that. And you feel like, sure, Wit has maybe figured some things out here and there, as anybody does over time, but there's also just this I like the line about there's the line when he has the phone call with Ginny or Jenny where he says something about I had never told her how bored I was. What was it?
Yeah.
Um yeah, lies about the money and the way I'd kept my boredom secret. And then you start wondering, well, is he bored with Elaine too? Does he see that he's bored with Elaine? Like, has that pattern even really changed?
I mean,
Um,
by the end of the story, it seems like he is, right?
right.
I mean, the way that he talks about he and Elaine's relationship at the end is, um, uh, what is he? He has some line about like, but not congratulating ourselves, right?
Yes, that's
Um,
right.
he says 25 years last June and two daughters. Have I loved my wife? We've gotten along.
Mm,
We've never felt like congratulating ourselves. It's not even like a yes, of course we've loved each other. It's like we've gotten along.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
it's
Here we
such
are.
a
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
It,
And even
I,
when he talks about his daughters, he says, the character does, he says, they're both grown. They're harmless citizens. They aren't beautiful or clever,
yeah.
which, oh, that's kind of devastating, right? Without
It,
being, an overloaded insult or an in-depth character, character sketch of either of them. They aren't beautiful or clever.
yeah.
Yeah, pain.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's what makes this story and again so much if not kind of all of his stories so powerful is they're wrestling with those emotions with that but without maybe ever being like and here's the lesson I learned or without
Mm,
like I mean it feels like the I don't know like the characters are really observant and they kind of like are self-aware but they're not like I don't know, the story feels more self-aware than they do. And
mhm,
so we get this like I don't know, just it helps it make feel more honest to me, I guess,
mhm.
in that like the the characters never quite understand what's going on, but they're
Yeah.
not, they're just sort of and there's something about that grasping for or falling short of that's
Mhm.
really interesting.
I think you're right. I think the stories, at least I think we can say this of a lot of the short fiction, the stories seem to know more than the characters do. But that's, the craft of writing standpoint, trying to pull that off in a first person piece is a real challenge. To like
Yeah,
sort of shade these things in that the narrator isn't quite tuned into, but the reader will maybe pick up on. Yeah, that's like a masterfully subtle trick to pull off,
right.
which I
Yeah.
wouldn't expect no less from Dennis Johnson. Yeah. One thing I kind of wanted to just hear what your thoughts are. And again, I read a lot of, I read Dennis Johnson stuff kind of more or less as it came out in the 2000s anyway, and never didn't really sort of stop to think of it all together until I was, working on our core episode, and I I kind of came to this realization that I don't know, I can't think of that many other writers who have as many different modes and whose work is at like tonally and premise in terms of premise and even like philosophically as different as Dennis Johnson's. I mean, you put Tree of Smoke next to this and you're like I'm not how is that the same guy?
Yeah, it's really like it feels I mean it does I guess the flip side of that is it all really does feel like the same guy.
Well, the
But
sentences
like,
feel the same. Yeah,
right?
the
But
sentences
like
feel the same. I'm thinking of like if you read the back of the
n
books, right?
no, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean
yeah.
it feels like he's really like was chasing a lot of different interests and maybe kind of like um I think really interestingly not ever kind of like getting stuck in a lane,
Hmm.
right? I
Hmm.
think it maybe would have been easy to keep writing fuckhead stories.
Oh yeah. Well, and
Um
I mean, it made money. I mean, right?
yeah.
Just simple as that. Yeah.
Um and but to see, the short novella of Train Dreams and this kind of like doorstop of Tree of Smoke and then the poetry collections
Mhm.
where he got to start um Yeah, it's
Some of
pretty
his other stuff
amazing.
that doesn't get talked about as much. Fiscadoro. I'm not sure if you've read Fiscadoro. That book is wild.
That book is bonkers. Yeah, I'm not totally sure what happens in a
Me
lot of
neither.
it, but it's kind of a blast to read.
It is. I mean, it's verging on maybe not even verging. I mean, it's psychedelic, basically.
Yeah,
There's becomes intractable at some point, but it's incredible. I mean, but it there's nothing else in his shelf that's like it
yeah.
really at all. Like even in the short stories, at least the ones that I've read, I can't think of a Dennis Johnson story that really veers hard into speculative at all.
Yeah, not
I
really.
don't think so.
And then too, like there's what is the Already Dead, I think,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Is the kind of genre-y
Like a little bit of a
like
thriller kind
a
of.
full lean into kind of like detective or noir.
Mhm.
Um uh
And the
yeah.
last one, oh, I'm forgetting the name. The very last novel he wrote, which was, oh shoot, what the heck is it? It was sort of a international kind of espionage is too strong of a word, but most of it is set in Africa. It's definitely like a thriller. There's plenty of action scenes and espionage like stuff. And I don't
Yeah,
know that
is that the Laughing
the
Monsters? Is
Laughing
that right?
Monsters, yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's totally different than totally different than everything that came before it, right? Very, very different than Train Dreams, very, very different than Tree of Smoke. Though Tree of Smoke is maybe the closest to it. And I guess, not to just kind of point out all of these differences. I kind of like what you said about this. This is a man trying to corral his very different interests. Um, I think there's something about Dennis Johnson too that there is a attitude of so I kind of got in depth on the story of how Jesus' son came to be, like
Uh-huh.
how it ended up on the shelves. And they were all these kind of stories he had laying around that he didn't really think much of. And
Yeah, that's what he says.
right, right.
I feel like there's some
Well,
self-mythologizing there,
that's probably true. I mean,
but
he
yeah,
didn't, yeah, and sort of kind of comb it together and send it out, and all of a sudden it's like this moment that you don't often get that often in literature, where a lot of people are reading it at the same time, and we're going to talk in the after dark portion for our Patreon and Substack supporters. We're going to talk more about Dennis Johnson's writing advice, and I want to hear more about your writing advice and your book, How to Write a Novel. Um, uh, but how influential is Dennis Johnson on like how writing is talked about now? I mean, people who listen to the show know I got an MFA like, oh my God, 11 years ago. So I'm a little far from like the academic, how this stuff is talked about. During my time, everybody knew Dennis Johnson. Is this still like is he still
I mean,
a
I
living
think
writer for
so. I
them?
mean, I guess I got my MFA a little bit before you even,
Mm,
and it was a little like I feel like there's a little bit of a cliche MFA guy who's like Jesus's son
who's
is
really
the
into yeah, who's
thing,
really into Dennis
right?
Johnson? Yeah, yeah,
Um,
that was me.
and I mean, same, right? I had to do a presentation at one point in a grad class, and so did it on Jesus's son, and was like, oh,
Mhm.
I'm gonna steer into the skid here and just be all the way this guy.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I don't teach, so I teach undergrads
Okay.
now. And I don't really teach Dennis Johnson in part, like I've struggled to teach him because like my lesson is usually like, I don't know, be a genius.
Right, right, right,
Um,
right. Well, that is
but
the challenge of teaching him, right? It's like, okay, so we talked about all the stuff you should do, and then here's this. So,
yeah, and
yeah.
it's just like it's so easy to take away all the wrong lessons from his stories, I
Yes.
think.
Yes.
Um, but I think there's a real generation of us um who are really influenced and return to him. And I think, as with like anybody who becomes that influential, I think we all kind of like look to him for different things, or maybe we take different things.
Mm.
And so sometimes it's really visible and other times maybe less so. But I do think there's something, and I was thinking about this just rereading the story. I think one of the things that I really took away from him, and coming back to your comment about the Jesus' son stories, just being like, oh, these were a bunch of stories I just kind of like threw together and I had
Mhm.
around, and they were like, I think apocryphally either stories that he would tell at the bar, or people had told him,
Yeah,
right?
I think that's part of it. Yeah. Yeah, it's part of the myth.
And I think what I take from that is in my own writing, I do like to be a storyteller. I think part of my joy in writing isn't just to write a good story, but to be able to tell an entertaining story,
Mhm.
right? And I think, when I'm hanging out at the bar with friends, kind of like part of my personality is like I like telling the best, funniest story.
Okay. Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I think that's what I sort of borrow from Dennis Johnson too, is his like, oh, how do you tell a good story? It's just sort of like, and whether it's breaking a writing rule or not, it's sort of like, when am I going to write a sentence that's going to grab your attention? When am I going to talk directly to you?
Mhm.
I mean, in the section that I read, even there was, um, what is
Oh,
the
yeah. I wonder if
line?
you
Yeah,
Yeah, I wonder if you're like me, if you collect and
yeah,
squirrel
yeah.
away in your soul certain odd moments when the mystery winks at you. I that stood out to me too, and that's one of those beautiful. That is something that probably a little point at least that could be a teachable, and that like that works incredibly well. But if there was one of those on every other page, it wouldn't work at all.
No, you really have to know when to use them,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
This is a slightly different move, but when I talk about in teaching, one of the things that I talk about sometimes is variation
Hmm.
and highs and lows. And being my age and having grown up in the Pacific Northwest, my go-to lesson is just uh, loud, quiet, loud, right?
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
and I think often sort of like my favorite parts of kind of all of those songs, but I think maybe the one that jumps to mind really is the Foo Fighters songs. And like my favorite specific Foo Fighters songs, and then my favorite moments in those songs are when the music cuts out and Dave just like screams at me for a minute.
Right.
And sometimes when a song doesn't do that, I'm like, oh, like I really want Dave screaming at
Right.
me.
Right.
But
Right.
if that was every song, then it loses its effect, right? Like part of
Yes.
that effect is like, oh, I'm really only going to do it every six songs, and you're going to
Yeah.
have to wait for it. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, only once in a story, or can I really like reach out and be like, I wonder if you are like me, or ask you
Mm-hmm.
directly a question, like how do
Yeah.
you know when to be sparse with that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of reminds me way back before my MFA. I think like the first piece of writing advice I ever got in a workshop when I was an undergrad was the teacher, the guy teaching the course said after reading some bit, and this was literally like the second, the first thing that I'd ever put into a workshop. He sort of told me, he's like, you don't have to do backflips all the time.
Yeah, right.
You can just you did one and we were like, oh, that was a good backflip. And then you just kept doing them and it's it's a bit much. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and I think, yeah, I mean, knowing that variation, right? And
Yeah,
and
it's huge.
again, sort of um I feel like so much of it comes from, as a writer, I feel like it's really often kind of instinctual. Is like knowing, I don't think there's like a formula, or do I have a specific craft lesson for like when or how to
Mhm.
use that you point of view, or when and how to do whatever your story's version of a pack flip is.
Yeah.
But it feels like the one of the things that I think about teaching and my own like being a reader is trying to write enough and read enough that then I've built that into me, right? So it's
Yeah.
like a gymnast of like, okay, I've just done a floor routine so many
Right.
times that like when I need to backflip, I know that that's what I should do
Uh,
next. And
Right, right.
like,
Yeah. And
I mean, I'm
sometimes I'm
sure
just
like,
setting up and sometimes I'm just
right.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's the thing that I've come to admire the most about Dennis Johnson. There's writers that who I love on the plot, on the scale of what is this whole thing doing.
Yeah.
And there's writers I love on the sentence level, and I do love Dennis Johnson, so many Dennis Johnson sentences. But there's something for me that's I feel like I've taken the most from him, is almost at like the paragraph level. It's this: how are we migrating between, yeah, kind of an old man wandering in the street
Hmm.
to finding this sentence that feels like incredibly mystical, and then back to the old man in the wandering in the street. How does he make that all work? And it doesn't, but and yet nothing feels shoehorned in, nothing feels out of place. It's really, I mean, to me, that's as a writer, if I'm sitting there thinking about, like, what are some things I can borrow from people, it does seem to be at that level, at these highs and lows, making the universal general and the general universal also. I mean, I think that kind of comes part and parcel with this process, but
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think as much as I love some of these sentences on like a just like, oh, that's a sharp dagger, perfect sentence,
mhm,
the the real joy of them is often how do you get into and out of that,
mhm,
right? Um, and thinking about, yeah, I mean, I think in this story and thinking of it instructively, I mean, one of my notes to myself was at the end of Widow. Um, Oh, right before we get to Orphan on page 19, he
mhm,
has this moment where um what is it? He's with his friend uh Ellis, who's talking to him about who's telling him this story about going to see this man on death row, right? And then going to
yeah,
see that man's widow. And then it ends with before long we wandered into a discussion of the difference between repentance and regret. You repent the things you've done and regret the chances you let get away. Then,
mhm,
as sometimes happens in a San Diego cafe, more often than you'd think, we were interrupted by a beautiful young woman selling roses. And I just like wrote in the margin, like, how do you arrive at that as the ending? Like, how do you
right,
go like, and so there's something about, I think there's a bunch of different lessons, and maybe circling all the way back to your like art is putting two things next to each other. It's like,
mhm,
oh, I'm gonna go a little philosophical with the difference between repentance and regret, but then I'm
mhm.
gonna pair that philosophical kind of epiphanic moment with, and then we were interrupted by a beautiful girl.
Right,
uh,
right, right,
and
right.
like how
Which,
it's so good.
yeah, which we could get all like English majory about and think about, well, is it important that it's a beautiful girl and that it's roses? And sure, it is, right? Yeah.
Right.
That's the perfect thing to interrupt it. But dissecting it to a certain ex point kind of ruins it as this
Yeah.
as this sort of lovely as this lovely lightness to it. That just, yeah, absolutely. No, that's so good. There's one other thing about this story, and it jumped out more at me. I guess this is like the third time I've read it. Um, I got thinking about the title, "The Largesse of the Sea Maiden," and as far as I can tell, it seems to be referring to the woman in the bar, in the snowed-in bar scene. I
Yeah.
think that's supposed to be her, sort of. Um, though it's not, he never, that section is called Mermaid, but he never puts too fine a point on it, which is part of the genius of the story, I think.
Yeah.
But there's also these passages, what is this sub story? This is from Orphan. Um, quote, he believed in spells and whammies and such, in angels and mermaids, omens, sorcery, windborne voices, in messages and patterns, right? So you got that, and then there's another one. I don't know if I highlighted it, but right at the very end of the story, and folks who are listening, if you haven't read it, you should go read it. And also, I'm going to read you the last paragraph. Quote, once in a while, I lie there as the television runs, and I read something wild and ancient from one of several collections of folk tales I own. Apples that summon sea maidens, eggs that fulfill any wish, and pears that make people grow long noses that fall off again. Then sometimes I get up and don my robe and go out into our quiet neighborhood looking for a magic thread, a magic sword, a magic horse. And there's another there's another bit like that somewhere in there. And one of the things that I realized that I don't even know if I registered it on the first reading, is this like it's sort of a life. Wit has come to a kind of a life of boredom, I guess. Something that's not the right word. If I was French, I'd say ennui, maybe. Uh, uh, but then these these moments where he's drawn or he's attracted to or he notices in some way like the weirdness, the deeper weirdness of everything manifested as, folk tales and mermaids and whammies um and I don't know if I even have a point or a question there. I just that really stuck out to me. And it was, again, he does it in like three places over the course of 40 pages. You barely even notice it in a way. And I think it's sort of it's almost like the secret ingredient to me of the entire story somehow.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, and there's an echo in at least a couple of ways in the ending of Farewell that I read, right?
Hmm.
That like I wonder if you're like me, if you collect and squirrel away in your
Yes.
soul certain odd moments when the mystery winks at you. That mystery feels like these sea maidens and
Hmm.
mermaids and
Hmm.
and magic swords, right?
Yes. Yes.
Um, and so there's something about you're right. Like it's echoed throughout the story, but never feels like hitting the nail on the head. And the only reason I'm as my attention is as drawn to it as it even is because it's the title of the story
Yeah.
and then it's the last line. So it's like,
Hmm.
oh, there's something important here.
Right.
And I think the kind of reader I am, I think there's a way of probably like digging into what the story is trying to say with that.
Hmm.
And like, I don't know, what is the symbolism or thematic meaning? But like in my reading, I just love it on a pleasurable
Yeah.
reading
Yeah.
level. And then my lesson from it is to be like, what are going to be my stories, magical moments of magic swords and magic
Right.
horses that
Right.
my character might notice, right? This
Right.
character feels fascinated by folk tales. Whereas my characters are often just kind of like those things are little moments of beauty in their everyday lives or
Hmm.
little moments of nostalgia. And so I feel like that's a big thing where I feel like some of my stories maybe do feel very Dennis Johnson-y and others maybe don't, but I think they're often looking for those moments of kind of magic in the world.
Yeah. 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 And again, having done some look into the sort of story of Dennis Johnson's life, I mean, he was sort of a seeker. He was always looking for something, fill in the blank, salvation or God or some kind of enlightenment or something. I don't know to what extent he got it. I think often about so apparently you're familiar with his final poetry collection, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and I can never remember the title because it's very long, and it's taken from the name of a work of art made by this fellow James Hampton. You have it there?
I was just I was just reading this actually the other day, right? It's the throne of the third heaven of the nation's Millennium General Assembly,
Right, right,
right?
right. And that's the name of an installation piece put together by this sort of outsider artist in Washington, D.C., James Hampton. We actually did an episode on James Hampton too, of
Oh, cool.
interesting story. And that was what sparked me like, we'll do a Dennis Johnson episode too. Um, because Dennis Johnson clearly knew about that.
Yeah.
He had apparently when he was writing Tree of Smoke, and I think this applies to all of his work. He had this note up next to his computer, which said, quote, if I'm some kind of James Hampton, and this is some kind of throne of the third millennium, if it's 2,000 years and 2,000 pages and 200 years, so be it. Um, and there's just something so kind of pushing all your chips in on that I just absolutely love. And maybe he didn't bring that attitude to Largesse of the Sea Maiden. I don't know. Maybe I know Tree of Smoke would have. I mean, it's an effort that well, only one guy ever pulled it off, right? So, so it's basically impossible to do. Uh,
Right.
but it does suggest to me that this searching. Dennis Johnson wasn't just a guy. He was an incredible storyteller. Wrote some of the best lines we've come across in sort of among contemporary writers. But he's also a man looking for something. And what I kind of love about how that comes across in the page is it's never heavy-handed. It,
Hmm.
it never delves into preachiness or like I figured it out or here. It never does that. And I wonder sometimes if he was tempted to, or if that just never even crossed his mind.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I wonder too, I guess. And I think this is a completely separate point, but I'm going to tie the two
Yeah,
together
like it.
in a little bit of a way. Um, when I was rereading Jesus's Son, I think last year, I just fell in love with it again, as I do every time I revisit it. And then I got thinking about like my own story collection that I was in the middle of, and then I'm considering like what goes in and what doesn't. And I spent some time looking around, and I couldn't really find any published Dennis Johnson stories that weren't in Jesus' Son,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
And so that idea of like I don't know. Like it wasn't like he published 40 stories and then these nine or the
mhm.
like it's like these are kind of the nine that he
Those are
had
the nine.
published.
Yeah, that's them. Yeah.
Um and just thinking about your again, it's kind of a different point, but something about the way that you framed like was he ever tempted to like I mean, I'm thinking about, you know, did he have other stories and was he just like good at telling what worked and what didn't and those
Mm.
just like we don't get to see and or yeah I don't
That's a good
know.
point. I'm sure there's material. Well, he's ever any writer has material that no one's
Yeah,
ever seen, right? For it's either in a drawer or thrown away or set on fire or revised so much that it's unrecognizable. Yeah.
right. And I
Yeah.
know when I teach, I'm a big encourager of my students to like let yourself say it cheesy or let
Mhm,
yourself say it on the nose
mhm.
and then revise. I think sometimes we can be so scared of that when drafting that we don't allow ourselves to get there. And so I don't know, you know, I know nothing about Johnson's process, but I know for lots of us, and I certainly know for myself, like sometimes I need to when drafting a story, I need to like make the big preachy
Right,
revelation.
right, right,
And
right,
then when
right.
drafting, it's like, oh,
Yeah, it's
actually, he should
right.
be
It's like
thinking about
this
folk
is what
tales. Like,
this is what I'm trying to say, and then
yeah,
asterisk, don't make it not suck. Yeah,
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 yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk. This is a good time to talk a little bit about your work. You know, starting with your book of craft essays, How to Write a Novel, a collection of craft essays, quote, none of which ever mention writing. Tell us a little bit about that book. I fortunately, you know, I, this show we have yeah, writers on, and sometimes I've read their stuff, and sometimes I haven't. And frankly, Aaron, I haven't read your work, um, but I'm buying that book because I need to know how to write a novel. I've written some, and every time I write work on one, I realize I don't know what I'm doing. So, but tell us a little bit about that book.
yeah. So, it kind of started as a joke. Um, and I'm trying to, I'm wondering if I can find it.
Sorry,
Uh,
I caught you somewhat
Sorry,
unawares.
yeah.
Yeah,
At some
yeah.
point I just tweeted. I tweeted, I would like to edit a how to write a novel craft anthology with essays about skateboarding and houseplants and making art and 70s paranoid thrillers and going to the driving range and petting zoos and road trips and naps and tattoos. And it never mentions writing.
Yeah.
So I think on the one hand, it was like a part jokey, part probably a little bratty, just like tossed off tweet about like I probably had seen one too many like I either specific like tweets about craft or tweets about craft books, right? And I think that when I talk about writing in the classroom and when I think about it for myself, as often as not, I think about it in the way that a baseball player talks about baseball, or sort of a rapper talks about rapping, or a dancer talks about dancing. And there's something about that that helps often me sort of like, oh, if I'm just talking about writing, it feels like I can get lost in the weeds a little bit. But if I'm reminded of, the way a basketball player like watches film, then there's something about that's how I'm trying to get my students to read a story, right? I'm trying to get them
Right.
to sort of be like, I'm trying to get them to read like a writer, like a basketball player watches basketball, or like
Mhm.
a movie director watches movies, right? And being like, oh, how can I steal that? How can I one up
Yeah.
that? How can I do that better? How can
Well,
I
that's huge. I am totally on board with this. I mean, in part, and in no small part, because there does get to be this thing if it's just writers talking about writing all the time, that there's no it comes to be that thing where there's like that spate of sort of campus novels where you're like,
right?
they're like, oh, you didn't pay attention to the rest of life, and so this is all you've got left is to write this story, which is, and it's kind of like that, can be like that for craft, I think, too, where you sort of get stuck in a loop where all you can talk about is other writers and their writing, right? Um,
Yeah. And
Not that
and
there
I
isn't a ton to
think
learn there, but just that it gets
no, for sure.
claustrophobic.
And
Yeah.
there's plenty of like craft stuff that I love and that I read and appreciate. But I,
Mhm.
I think a part of, it's called How to Write a Novel, and it's a little cheeky, and I think it's a good title. Like
Yeah.
there's no actual like novel writing lessons in it, but it's like personal essays about horseback riding and
Mhm.
skateboarding, but then also like an essay about Tom Cruise running in the movies, and an essay about like walking in alleys, and an essay about, cooking. Um, and I think there's kind of hopefully at least two or three things happening. Hopefully one, it's just an entertaining anthology of personal essays. Um, I think also it is a reminder that a big part of being a good writer, I think, is living a life, right? And sort of appreciating other things and doing other things, and that all of that, if you're a writer, all of that kind of is part of being a writer too, right?
Yes.
Like I think
Yes.
um and then a third thing was, I think maybe this is like cheesily Jesus-y and biblical or something, but there can be something about a parable, or about a right, and sort of like, I'm going to give you this lesson but in a roundabout way. And
Right.
so it's sort of like you might push against this lesson that I want to give you about finding your own voice in a short story. But like, what if I tell you about what it means to me to find my own skateboarding style?
Mhm.
And then you can make the metaphor yourself,
Right.
right?
Well, hey,
Um,
why not? I mean, there's a reason we got
right. I
parables that are
haven't actually
thousands of
made
years
that
old.
connection to
Yeah.
parables, I don't think, until I
Yeah.
was kind of right there in the middle of it.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the idea.
Mhm.
And I think when I was taking submissions for the anthology, for the most part, people really got it. And sometimes some of the submissions would kind of like make the metaphor explicit, right? There would be a moment where it would be like, and how I do that in my own writing is
Right.
X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And then as an editor, I was like, no, we need to cut that.
Just get
Like
rid of that
we're
part.
we're
Yeah.
never going to clarify the metaphor.
Right.
We're just giving the metaphor itself, and then you can kind of put the
Right.
puzzle together as the reader.
Right. Well, and then here's the thing, man. If you can't find that metaphor yourself, you might not be ready to write a novel,
Right.
frankly. Not, not the gatekeep or anything, but it seems like
Yeah.
you should be able to put that, put two and two together.
Right.
Um, so we're drawing to a close here, Aaron. This has been so much fun. It's been so great to get to know you here a little bit and talk to you, and I really do appreciate your time so much. Tell people where they can find you.
So I'm on Twitter and Instagram at my name, Aaron Burch, with two underscores in between them. So Aaron underscore Burch. I have a website, aaronburch.net, that I like many writers have been very bad about updating. But
Yeah.
there's some, and so the bio on there is probably a year, maybe two old. There's some new stuff.
Well, and you're a busy guy, so that changes. I mean,
Yeah.
some writers it doesn't ruin that. You can update it for every 5 years and it's fine, but you got a lot going on, man. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm pretty active on social media, and then the website is there.
Cool. Awesome. Well, folks, definitely check Aaron out. Uh, he's got a lot of great stuff. All links for all that will be in the show notes. You know where to find those. And yeah, again, Aaron, thank you so much. We just discovered, or well, I discovered that we're both Michiganders, and
There we
so
go.
perhaps we'll
Yeah.
cross paths. You should come to, we're having Art of Darkness live in Hamtramck in October, Halloween party. Houdini's
Where
The
at in
Death of Houdini,
Hamtramck?
Planet Ant Community Theater.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
think about that. It would be cool.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's good to
yeah,
know that you're out there.
sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Fred.